So, between the 11th and the 17th of December, there will be about 1,190 transatlantic flights from Latin America, which amounts to an average of 170 daily flights during that week. All of these flights are operated by 39 airlines between multiple cities in Latin America and multiple cities in Europe, Africa, and the Middle East. The main airport for all of these flights is Madrid, which holds about 336 of these flights, or about 48 daily, which makes sense given the strong relationship between many Latin American countries and Spain. Nearly every Spanish-speaking country has at least one direct flight to Madrid, with the only exception being Nicaragua. This is followed by Paris-Charles de Gaulle with 133 flights, or 221 flights if you include the 88 flights from Paris-Orly. Next on the list is Amsterdam with 123 flights, then Lisbon with 102, and London Heathrow with 74. Although if you include Gatwick 67 flights, you get third place with 141 flights. And lastly, there's Frankfurt with 67. Outside of Europe, the main airports are Istanbul with 35 flights. That's assuming that Istanbul doesn't count as European. Otherwise, it's Doha with 21. Meanwhile, in Latin America, the main airports for transatlantic flights are Sao Paulo Guarulhos with 177 flights, followed by Mexico City with 108, Buenos Aires with 95, Bogota with 90, Cancun with about 86, and Punta Cana with 49, the latter two being very popular destinations among European travelers. Surprisingly, the airline offering the most transatlantic frequencies in December is Air France with 140 flights from Paris-Charles de Gaulle and Paris-Orly combined. The second one is Iberia with 122 flights per week, 133 if you include flights operated by Level. This is followed by KLM with 96 weekly flights. The fourth place is taken by Air Europa with 87 flights, followed by TAP Portugal with 85. The main Latin American airlines flying to Europe are LATAM with 60 flights, Avianca with 49, and Aeromexico with 48. I'm pretty sure these are pretty obvious. Meanwhile, the main non-European airline flying to Latin America is Turkish Airlines with 35 flights, but if Turkish counts as European, then it's Qatar with 21. Meanwhile, the ranks for the destination count are different. KLM with 20 destinations, followed by Air Europa and British Airways with 19, then Air France and Iberia with 18 destinations, followed by TAP Portugal's 14 destinations. And well, now I'm going into more detail on each of the airline's transatlantic flights. Starting with the Iberian Peninsula, Spain's flag carrier Iberia uses their fleet of Airbus A350 and A330s on 122 weekly flights from Madrid to 18 destinations in Latin America. The top route is Mexico City, which in December will have 21 flights per week or 3 daily flights. Another 6 routes are going to have at least one daily flight, and there's actually one triangular flight from Madrid to Guatemala City, San Salvador, and back to Madrid. Iberia is part of the International Airlines Group, along with Level, which has 11 flights to Latin America, from Barcelona to Buenos Aires and Santiago, as well as summer seasonal flights to Cancun and Punta Cana. Air Europa will have about 87 flights per week in December from Madrid to 19 destinations in Latin America using their fleet of Boeing 787s. They mostly fly to smaller destinations that are not served by Iberia, although they do compete directly with Iberia on 9 routes. Most of their flights have fewer than one frequency, while only 6 of them are daily. Some interesting routes include Madrid to Cordoba via Asunción. They also have their triangular route to Quito and Guayaquil. An interesting thing is that Air Europa only flies to Cancun in Mexico, probably because Aeromexico provides Air Europa with flights from Mexico City, Guadalajara, and Monterrey, therefore basically completing Air Europa's Latin America network. Their other partner airlines in Latin America include GOL and Aerolíneas Argentinas. TAP Air Portugal is going to have 79 weekly flights to 14 destinations in Latin America from Lisbon. Most of these flights are to Brazil, as well as Cancun, Caracas, and Punta Cana. Although Punta Cana is supposed to end on October 29th, there are also another 6 flights from Porto to Sao Paulo and Rio de Janeiro. TAP uses their Airbus A330-900s and their Airbus A321LR that flies to some of the smaller cities in northwestern Brazil. The main route for TAP is obviously Lisbon to Sao Paulo Guarulhos, with 18 flights per week, while they also operate a triangular flight from Lisbon to Natal and Maceió. There are also a few other minor players in Spain. That includes Iberjet, which operates mostly leisure flights to Latin America. There's Plus Ultra Airlines, and also World to Fly, a leisure airline that actually has a codeshare agreement with Iberia. Among Latin American airlines, we got LATAM Airlines with 60 flights to 8 destinations in Europe, more than any other Latin American carrier. Most of these flights are from Sao Paulo, which makes sense because its location can offer good connections to Europe, and especially because of all the demand from Brazil into Europe. But there are also direct flights from Lima and Santiago to Madrid. Flights from Sao Paulo to Johannesburg are coming back in July 2023. Then there's Avianca with 49 flights to Madrid, Barcelona, and London Heathrow, from Bogota, as well as Medellin and Cali to Madrid. Madrid to Bogota will get up to 4 daily frequencies this winter. Avianca is also seeking permission to fly from Medellin and Cali to Barcelona, and if I recall correctly, they used to fly to Lufthansa's hubs in Frankfurt and Munich from Bogota, but they're now terminated. In the last two there's Aeromexico, the main airline in Mexico with 48 flights per week to Madrid, Paris, Amsterdam, and London Heathrow. The main destination is obviously Madrid, with 2 daily flights from Mexico City, but also 5 weekly flights from both Monterrey and Guadalajara. These two began last year in December 2021. The second most popular destination is Paris Charles de Gaulle, with 10 weekly flights, which makes a lot of sense because it's Air France's main hub, and Aeromexico has a very close relationship with Air France. The closure agreements with other airlines like KLM and Air Europa are also very helpful to Aeromexico. Other Latin American airlines that have transatlantic flights include Azul, with twice daily flights from Campinas to Lisbon, a very important flight in the Azul TAP Air Portugal joint venture. Aerolíneas Argentinas has twice daily flights to Madrid and once daily to Rome, both from Buenos Aires. There's also Boliviana, with 4 flights from Madrid to Santa Cruz, and also a triangular flight from Santa Cruz to Madrid, to Cochabamba, and back to Santa Cruz. And lastly, there's Suriname Airlines with a 3 weekly flights to Amsterdam. Now going back across the Atlantic to France, Air France with 140 weekly flights in December is the airline offering the most flights between Europe and Latin America. 116 of these flights are from Paris Charles de Gaulle to destinations all over the continent, and 24 domestic flights from Paris Orly to Pointe-à-Pitre, Fort-de-France, and Cayenne. Aircraft is an airline actually based in Pointe-à-Pitre, in the Caribbean islands that are part of France, but all 42 of the transatlantic flights fly out of Paris Orly to Fort-de-France, Pointe-à-Pitre, Cayenne, Punta Cana, and Cancun, the latter of which starts on October 22nd. These are all flown on the Airbus A330 and A350 fleet, including the very large A350-1000. Corsair is the last French airline that flies to the Caribbean with 17 flights per week out of Paris Orly, Fort-de-France, Pointe-à-Pitre, and Punta Cana. But there's another 2 flights to Pointe-à-Pitre, one from Bordeaux and one from Lyon. These are both seasonal flights. There's also another one from Nantes to Fort-de-France, but I didn't see any available flights for this December. In the UK, there's British Airways with 36 flights out of London Heathrow and 35 out of London Gatwick. London Heathrow, as we know, is the main business hub for the airline. So most flights out of Heathrow are to largest cities in Latin America like Mexico City, Sao Paulo, or Santiago, but there are also flights to Barbados and the 6 weekly flights to Nassau, of which 2 continue to Providenciales and 4 to Grand Cayman. These flights are mostly flown on the airline's Boeing 787 and A350 fleets. The one interesting thing is that the 7 weekly flight to Sao Paulo is on the A350-1000, of which 3 will continue to Buenos Aires, but British Airways will also have another 3 direct flights to Buenos Aires from Heathrow on the 787. From Gatwick, British Airways will fly 35 flights per week, all of them with its Boeing 777-200ER, including 4 weekly to Barbados, daily to Cancun, and 3 weekly to Kingston, Punta Cana, and San Jose. There will be 7 flights per week to Antigua, of which 2 will continue to St. Kitts and 1 to Grenada. Then there's the 8 weekly flights to St. Lucia, of which 3 will continue through Grenada, and 2 of them to Port of Spain. At least that's what's going to be this winter. But it's all going to change in March 2023. The flight to Port of Spain becomes a non-stop. Tobago's stopover changes from Antigua to St. Lucia, and Georgetown will begin via St. Lucia, while St. Kitts and Grenada will keep their current stopovers. Virgin Atlantic has 21 flights from London Heathrow to the Caribbean, plus another 4 from Manchester this winter. These flights include Montego Bay and Antigua, but also a flight to Montego Bay via Nassau, and 10 flights per week to Barbados, of which 2 continue to Grenada, 2 to St. Vincent, and lastly 2 to Tobago. And finally 4 weekly seasonal flights from Manchester to Barbados. Most of these operate with the Boeing 787-9, but also a few with the A330-300. TUI Airways, the main long-haul leisure airline in the UK, they have 32 flights to the Caribbean during the winter season. 14 other flights come out of London Gatwick, including 5 per week to Cancun, which becomes daily in the summer, while the remaining destinations tend to have fewer frequencies. There are going to be about 13 flights from Manchester as well, and also 5 from Birmingham to both Cancun and Punta Cana. Many of TUI Airways flights are seasonal. Winter seasonal flights include the flights from London, Manchester, and Birmingham to Barbados. Summer seasonal flights include the flights from London to Aruba, Birmingham to Punta Cana, and also Cancun from other smaller cities in the UK like Newcastle, Bristol, Edinburgh, and others. Doncaster to Cancun is set to end this year with the closure of Doncaster Airport, and Dublin to Cancun is going to start in June 2023. Lastly, there's Aer Lingus UK, which is going to have 3 weekly frequencies between Manchester and Barbados during the winter season using the Airbus A330s. In mainland Europe, KLM is currently the largest airline when it comes to total destinations, with 20 destinations and 96 flights. All of them are from Amsterdam Schiphol. The most popular flight is the twice daily to Curaçao. There are 8 destinations that are at least once daily, and also a few triangular routes this winter, including the following city pairs: Aruba and Bonaire, Bogota and Cartagena, and lastly Quito and Guayaquil. Another flight that KLM flies to is Santiago via Buenos Aires. There are 2 winter seasonal flights, including Cancun and San Jose. There's a direct flight to St. Martin, as well as a triangular flight to Barbados and Port of Spain. That's just during the winter, because Barbados is seasonal. In the summer, KLM instead flies the triangular flight to St. Martin and Port of Spain. Lufthansa has 26 flights from Frankfurt to Mexico City, Sao Paulo, San Jose, Bogota, and Buenos Aires, using either the Boeing 747-8 and the A330-300. They also fly to Rio de Janeiro from Munich 4 times per week using the A350-900, while the flights from Munich to Mexico City remain suspended. Other flights that are not flown by Lufthansa are instead operated by Eurowings, like Frankfurt to Cancun, Panama City, Punta Cana, as well as Montego Bay via Puerto Plata, and also Munich to Cancun and Punta Cana. While flights to Barbados are suspended for now, other Lufthansa subsidiaries also fly to Latin America. Austrian Airlines flies from Vienna to Cancun using the Boeing 777-200ER. Swiss flies 7 flights per week from Zurich to Sao Paulo using the 777-300ER, of which 2 will continue the trip towards Buenos Aires. And Edelweiss Air has 10 flights per week from Zurich to Latin America, including Cancun, Punta Cana, and San Jose. Well, there are also 3 triangular flights from Zurich to Havana and Cancun, to Puerto Plata and Montego Bay, and to San Jose and Liberia, while the seasonal flights to Varadero are currently suspended. The last full-service airlines are Finnair with seasonal flights to Puerto Vallarta and Punta Cana, ITA Air, which has daily flights from Rome to Buenos Aires and Sao Paulo, which is great because of the huge Italian diaspora in Argentina and Brazil. And also a lot of Polish airlines with multiple charter flights into the Caribbean from several cities in Poland like Warsaw, Katowice, and Poznań, as well as others like Prague and Vilnius. Other European airlines include the many leisure airlines such as Condor, a German leisure airline that flies 26 flights per week to the Caribbean this winter, from Frankfurt to places like Cancun and Punta Cana, which are going to be daily, but also other year-round destinations like Varadero, Montego Bay, and Havana, and a few triangular flights like Frankfurt to Puerto Plata and Santo Domingo. All the seasonal Frankfurt to Grenada and Tobago. The seasonal Frankfurt to Barbados is suspended, but there seem to be also a few seasonal charter flights from Frankfurt, Munich, and Dusseldorf. Condor also has closure agreements with Latin American airlines, including Volaris, that offer connections at Cancun. Another interesting airline in Europe is Neos, which seems to have a few suspended flights, but is going to fly about 8 weekly flights this winter, including Milan to La Romana and Rome to La Romana. The latter actually starts in Verona and makes a stopover at Rome. The remaining flights are triangular flights, including Milan to Cancun and Havana, Milan to Havana and Cayo Coco, and Milan to Havana and Holguin, and also Milan to Montego Bay and Varadero, and finally Rome to Havana and Cancun. Sunclass Airlines, from what I've noticed, are having 1 weekly flight this winter, starting in Copenhagen to Punta Cana with a stopover in Stockholm, while the return flight is direct to Copenhagen. Air Belgium is another weird one, with a couple of routes, including Brussels to Punta Cana and Brussels to Bonaire, Curaçao, and back. And there's also a flight from Charleroi to Fort-de-France, Pointe-à-Pitre, and back to Charleroi, which is interesting considering it's a different base. I recently talked about TUI Airways, but that was TUI Airways UK, but now I'm talking about TUI Fly Belgium with 6 flights from Brussels per week, including Cancun once, Punta Cana twice, and the triangular Brussels to Varadero and Cancun once, and Brussels to Punta Cana and Montego Bay twice. TUI Fly Netherlands will have 17 flights to 7 destinations, including a lot of triangular routes to Dutch territories in Aruba, Curaçao, Bonaire, and Sint Maarten, and non-stop flights to Cancun and Curaçao. Lastly, there's TUI Fly Nordic, with seasonal charter flights from Copenhagen and Stockholm to Puerto Plata. Turkish Airlines would count as European because Istanbul is in Europe, but I put it together with the Middle Eastern Airlines because of their business model. Turkish will have about 35 flights per week to Latin America, operated by their 777s, 787-9s, and Airbus A350s, including 7 weekly flights from Istanbul to Sao Paulo Guarulhos, of which 4 will continue to Buenos Aires. Then there's the daily triangular flights from Istanbul to Bogota and Panama City, the 3 weekly flights from Istanbul to Havana and Caracas, and the most successful route in the region is a flight to Mexico City and Cancun 11 times per week. And lastly, there's direct flights from Istanbul to Caracas 4 times per week and Istanbul to Panama City 3 times per week on the 787. The two other Middle Eastern airlines that fly to Latin America are Qatar Airways, which has 3 daily flights from Doha to Sao Paulo Guarulhos using the Boeing 777-300ER, and is probably quite dependent on the LATAM Airlines partnership. And then there's Emirates with 18 flights, including daily from Dubai to Sao Paulo using the Airbus A380, and 4 times weekly flight to Rio de Janeiro that continues to Buenos Aires. And lastly, there's daily flights from Dubai to Mexico City with a stopover in Barcelona. The two latter will be operated using the Boeing 777-200LR. And finally, there's Africa with Angola-based TAG Angola Airlines that will have one weekly seasonal flight from land to Havana because of corrupt politicians probably, and the more important flight from Luanda to Sao Paulo 5 times per week. And also there's Ethiopian Airlines, which flies daily from Addis Ababa to Sao Paulo, where it continues to Buenos Aires. And that's it. But I'm pretty sure y'all have noticed that there are a few airlines that I haven't mentioned. First of all, there's Cubana's flights from Cuba to Madrid, operated by Plus Ultra Airlines it seems, using the Airbus A340-300. The flight basically starts in Madrid, flies to Santiago de Cuba, then to Havana, and back to Madrid. That's Cubana's flight. There's also Venezuela's Cambiasa, with flights from Caracas to Madrid, to Moscow, Vnukovo, and Tehran. And apparently they're supposed to begin flights to Doha quite soon, and also to Guangzhou via Tehran. I don't know, these airlines are pretty sketchy. And finally, there's Russia and Ukraine. Well, the full-scale invasion began in February 2022 after 8 years of war, and since then both countries have had all of their transatlantic flights suspended. Ukraine is pretty simple. Only 2 airlines had flights to the Caribbean before the invasion. Ukraine International Airlines was planning on adding seasonal charter flights to Cancun and La Romana from Kyiv, using the Boeing 777-300ER that they had on order. But this never happened. Meanwhile, Azur Air Ukraine, with the Boeing 787-300ER, had planned to add seasonal charter flights from Kyiv to La Romana, Cancun, and Punta Cana. If I recall correctly, Azur Air actually managed to start these flights before they were suspended because of the war. Meanwhile, the flag carrier of Russia, Aeroflot, had multiple flights from Moscow Sheremetyevo to Cancun, Havana, and Punta Cana. These flights have been suspended since February. Most of these were flown on the Airbus A350 aircraft. From what I've heard, Aeroflot was also planning on adding flights to Rio de Janeiro and Buenos Aires before February, and I think they were also planning to start flying to Mexico City, but do not quote me on that. Northwind Airlines had a huge set of operations to the Caribbean from Russia. Most of these flights were seasonal charters, and among them included the flights from Moscow Sheremetyevo to several cities in Cuba, the Dominican Republic, and Cancun, Mexico, as well as seasonal charter flights to Punta Cana from other cities in Russia, including Kazan, Krasnoyarsk, St. Petersburg, Novosibirsk, Ufa, and Yekaterinburg, although I'm not actually sure whether any of these were nonstop or not. The last airline from Russia was Azur Air, that had several flights to La Romana from several cities like Kazan, Moscow, St. Petersburg, Rostov, Ufa, Novosibirsk, and Yekaterinburg. They also had flights from Moscow Vnukovo to Cancun, Cayo La Romana, and Varadero. That was a lot of flights I just covered, but it shows just how huge the market is between Latin America and Europe, and that's not even the smallest market around. The one disappointment is South America to Africa with very few connections, especially since South African Airways sees long-haul operations and since Cabo Verde Airlines and Royal Air Maroc ended their flights to South America in 2020. Not sure if any of these are ever coming back, but hopefully they will. It is very likely that there will be a lot more transatlantic flights added from Latin America in the near future, and it doesn't seem like that growth is going to be ending anytime soon, unless something really bad happens. This was a pretty interesting analysis to make, so hopefully I'll be able to make more like this in the near future. So thanks for watching. If y'all got any comments, questions, feedback, or any suggestions, y'all can leave a comment. That's all I got to say, and I'll see y'all later.